Well, it's breathtaking to watch, really. Gaza has sort of become like the thread that you pull that unravels, you know, the whole fabric of Western so-called civilization. The entire narrative infrastructure of the West is collapsing. You know, I said that every missile that Israel launches against Gaza actually lands in America, and it's blowing the whole society apart. I mean, everything, everything about that so-called culture, that so-called civilization, which is actually nothing but a torture chamber for their own citizens, a torture chamber for the minds of their citizens, for their psyches, for their souls. It's being dismantled because of Gaza. You know, you've been imposing lies on your population for decades. No, for centuries. Inflicting cognitive dissonance on your people for centuries. Keeping your people boxed in a tight cage of ideological manipulation. It's like every individual citizen in your society is in some sort of an isolation cell that has beautiful pictures projected on the walls, just to lull them into thinking that they aren't imprisoned. You know, freedom, democracy, prosperity, upward mobility. You can be anything you dream of, so on and so on, etc., etc. All of this is being projected on the walls of their jail cells in America, in the collective West. And they can look at it, but they can't really go into it. You know, you can't experience what you're being shown. That's America. It's happy songs being pumped in over loudspeakers to drown out the sound of you and your neighbors weeping. Weeping because maybe their home is being foreclosed upon, or they lost their job, or they can't afford medicine or groceries, you know, or they're being evicted, or because someone that you love has been murdered or assaulted or abducted or raped. It's a dystopian reality constantly being gaslighted by utopian propaganda. You know, according to the average statistics, since October 7th, in the United States, roughly 10,000 Americans have been murdered. Just since October 7th, 200,000 American women have been raped, and over 100,000 children have been abducted in the United States just since October 7th. There's been nearly 150,000 home foreclosures since October 7th. Tens of thousands of people have become homeless since then, and even more have become jobless. But on the walls of your prison cell, all you see are projected pictures of wealth, of opulence, of extravagance, fun, happy, perfect, beautiful people living exciting, glamorous lives. Celebrities flaunting their wealth, singers bragging about their riches. That's what you look at all day long, 24 hours a day. Everyone that you're shown is a millionaire or a billionaire, but everyone that you've ever known is struggling financially, you and everyone you know. So there's a massive discrepancy in the reality that you know and the reality that they show. And Gaza is taking all that apart. Well, actually, Zionism is taking it apart. Zionism is destroying the whole architecture of how the West has managed the oppression of their own societies. It's exposing the West to the people of the West. And they're starting to realize just how corrupt and how psychopathic their so-called civilization is. It's all starting to hit them now. It's starting to register with them now, after all these years. And it's not just the students, it's not just the protesters, it's not just the activists, but regular, average, normal people in the West. It's dawning on them now that something is terribly, criminally wrong with their society, with their culture. Because look, there's a savage, vicious genocide that's happening right now, and you can see it. Everyone can see it. It's playing out right on the screen of your mobile phone, and your countries are backing it. Your countries, who you've always been told are the good guys, they're responsible for it. They're responsible for the genocide. Your countries are anti-peace and pro-genocide, and they want to ban and demonize anyone who supports peace and anyone who opposes mass murder. They want to shut down access to information, like banning TikTok. They want to arrest and prosecute people for not wanting to fund and enable the unspeakable bloodlust of the Zionists. You're starting to realize that your society is a monster, and that everyone in the world sees it as a monster, and there's a reason that they do, and that it is a monster even according to what you yourselves have been taught in the West, because you were always taught about how evil the Nazis were, how evil the Holocaust was, and now you see your own countries expressing their rock solid support, stand shoulder to shoulder, support for exactly the same type of ideology as the Nazis and the same types of crimes as the Nazis. But somehow you're not supposed to see all of this as an evil ideology, and you're not supposed to see their actions as crimes. Well, that doesn't work. By your own definitions, America and the collective West are monstrous villains, according to your own definitions. And that's making the people of the West have an existential crisis. They're questioning now everything that they ever took for granted to be reality, everything that they ever took for granted to be true, all the unquestioned assumptions that had ever been programmed into them to believe, they don't believe anymore. You know, it started with boycotting Starbucks and McDonald's. And once they did that, it broke a pattern. It broke a habit. Not only a consumer habit, but a habit of thinking. You realized I don't really need to spend $5 for a mediocre coffee. In fact, I don't really agree anymore that there's some kind of lifestyle status or class status that's displayed by walking around and taking selfies, pictures of myself carrying a Starbucks cup. And come to think of it, I'm actually kind of exhausted by the whole concept of displaying class status or a lifestyle status for other people to see and admire, a lifestyle that I don't have and can't afford, and no one that I know has and no one that I know can afford. Come to think of it, it's pretty messed up that we're all continuously pretending the whole time just so that we can somehow emulate the lives of the rich and famous when we're not rich and we're not famous. And you know what? Who are these rich and famous people anyway? All of this is happening to the States. Who are these rich people? Who are these celebrities anyway? What kind of people are they? Actually, come to think of it, we are the only reason that they are rich and famous to begin with. And they aren't even good people. They're not even people worth emulating. They're not even people worth admiring. They're either silent about the genocide or they're supportive of the genocide. So, you know, actually, let's block these people. And before you know it, support for Gaza is transforming into a class war. It's transforming into a whole movement against the worship of the elite, the fabricated elite, the parasitic elite. And I'm telling you, this is all being indirectly inspired by the tawheed of the people of Gaza. The people of the West are starting to tear down their own false idols and the whole quasi-religious secular worship of the rich, and all the high priests and high priestesses of ritualistic distraction, frivolity, and materialism. Zionism is colonization, and colonization is a manifestation of cancerous capitalism. And cancerous capitalism is a manifestation of Western supremacy, and Western supremacy is a manifestation of dehumanizing racism and classism. And racism and classism are a manifestation of a culture that has no genuine moral values and can only elevate itself by subjugating others. It's primitive. It's primitive and savage. It's primitive and savage and cynical. And once you realize that your country, your so-called civilization, once you realize that it is primitive and savage and cynical, when you see that that they're like that with others, then you start to recognize that they're even like that with you. They're even like that with their own citizens. You start to realize that you never stop being serfs in the West, and they never stop being feudal lords and feudal masters in the West. And the whole narrative that you grew up believing is just a tapestry of lies. It's a sack that they put over your head so that you could never see what's really going on. But like I said, that tapestry is unraveling today. And they're never going to be able to sew it back together again. Never. I think that the United States had a limited window of opportunity to break up with Israel. They had a limited time period when they could break up decisively with Israel before that toxic relationship infected their whole system. But that time has passed. It's too late. You should have moved decisively against Netanyahu months ago. If you didn't want your murderous hypocrisy to be exposed, you should have done something about Netanyahu before it was too late. You know, you're like one of those vampires from the vampire movies who has to get to safety before the sun comes up. but you didn't move fast enough. And now you're dissolving in the daylight in front of everybody. The explosions and the screams from Gaza were too loud to drown out with the soft jazz elevator music of American virtue. And everyone has heard their voices now. And that means that everyone knows that you've been trying to hide the truth from them all this time. You know, people in the West, people in America, and throughout the West, are collectively having their Oscar Schindler moment of clarity and guilt, realizing that while their societies were gorging them on entertainment, on music, late night talk shows, celebrity gossip, and pornography, atrocities were being committed. Carnage and brutal injustice was being inflicted on innocent people by their countries all around the world, and in their own countries, to be honest. And that they're realizing that the entirety of popular culture and mass media, all of that operated all this time as nothing but an anesthetic to dull their senses and numb their minds to the reality of their own so-called civilization's cruelty and violence. And now that they know, they're ripping out the tubes that pump that anesthetic into their bodies. They're blocking you now. All your celebrities, all your brands, your logos, your propaganda, all the smiling brand ambassadors who've gotten rich off of your neutralization, your exploitation, your nullification, and your desensitization. You thought you were just passing your time when you were binge watching Netflix. You didn't know that you were being deliberately distracted, deliberately diverted. Your attention was deliberately being redirected so that you wouldn't realize that crimes were being committed. Every time you press next episode. You had virtual reality goggles stuck on your head so that you wouldn't witness the crimes. And you welcomed those goggles. You welcomed that virtual reality because the actual reality of your own life was so boring and tedious and miserable. They filled your days with drudgery so that you would race to escapism. They filled your life with ugliness so that you would use whatever free moment you had to just passively and vicariously stare at the vapid beauty of celebrities. Oh, they've been drugging you. They've been sedating you for years now, for decades. And all this time, they've been making you the unknowing accomplice to their inhuman oppression and brutality. But the cries from Gaza, the explosions and the cries from Gaza broke through the white noise soundtrack of triviality and propaganda. You know, that's why they're persecuting the student protesters so hard. Because they're not just opposing Zionism and genocide, but by opposing Zionism and genocide, they're setting off a chain reaction. That chain reaction is short-circuiting the whole system of social engineering and control that has allowed the parasitic elite to ravage the entire planet for years, for decades, without scrutiny or accountability. So they're punishing those protesters because the protesters are saying that they've gone too far, and they can't accept the idea that there's even such a thing as too far for them. They're not supposed to have limits. They're not supposed to be bound by any sort of moral limitations, much less limitations that are being set by the people. You know, people who they disdain so profoundly that they think they can be replaced by AI and robots. They don't think you matter at all. And it enrages them that you think you do matter. And they're even more enraged precisely because of the way that the protests are being done by the targets of the activism. Because the protesters are focusing on the private sector. They're focusing on businesses, on investments, on financial partnerships, on funding. They're not focusing on politicians. You're supposed to direct all of your outrage and all of your anger and all of your grievances and all of your opposition at the decoys, at the effigies, at the fake representatives of power, the expendable puppet politicians dangled in front of you by the real private sector ruling class. So it's unforgivable that those protesters have torn down the curtain around real existing power and exposed the fallacy of democracy. Those protesters have started a fire that's going to burn straight through the whole system. But you can't blame them for the fact that your system has been flammable to begin with. That's your fault. The way you built your system made this inevitable. If you'd built your system on truth and honesty, on justice and genuine morality, and on decency and fairness, well, no one will be able to burn it down. But you built it, you decided, you chose to build it on deceit and hypocrisy, on unfairness and exploitation and bigotry, violence, racism, greed, and oppression. And that's all highly combustible. Those are highly combustible materials, you know? In hindsight, maybe it wasn't such a good idea to put a torch in the hand of the Statue of Liberty.